When we think of the Roman Empire, we imagine strength. We picture emperors commanding legions draped in purple robes, heads held high with the weight of divine authority. We think of marble statues, mighty armies, and a civilization that ruled the known world. Roman pride was legendary. Their power felt eternal. But even the greatest empires can break. Today we talk about Valerian, the only Roman emperor ever captured alive. But to understand how such a powerful man could suffer one of the most humiliating fates in ancient history, we need to go back to the 3rd century, when the empire was already crumbling, when plague, betrayal, and invasion were tearing Rome apart from within. Because Valerian's downfall didn't begin on the battlefield. It began in a world where the gods of Rome had already started to fall silent. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was coming apart at the seams. For centuries, Rome had ruled the known world, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Persian frontier, from the deserts of Africa to the cold forests of Germania. Its roads connected continents, its armies were feared, and its emperors were seen almost as gods. But all of that was starting to crumble. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire entered one of the darkest and most chaotic periods in its entire history, a time historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a crisis in every sense of the word: political, military, economic, and even spiritual. Emperors no longer ruled for decades. They ruled for months, sometimes only weeks before being assassinated, overthrown, or killed in battle. Loyalty meant nothing. Power changed hands not through law or elections, but through the sword. The imperial throne had become a death sentence. In just 50 years, Rome saw over 20 emperors, many of them generals who had seized power through military force. But the crisis wasn't just about politics. The empire was being attacked from all sides. In the north, Germanic tribes like the Alemanni and the Franks were crossing the Rhine and the Danube rivers, raiding Roman towns and destroying everything in their path. In the east, a powerful new enemy had risen, the Sassanid Empire of Persia under King Shapur I. At the same time, the empire was being eaten away from within. A deadly plague swept across the provinces, killing soldiers and civilians alike. It devastated entire cities, reduced the army's strength, and created fear across the population. Trade collapsed, farmland was abandoned. In some areas, the Roman currency became so worthless that people stopped using coins and returned to bartering goods directly. Provinces declared independence or broke away entirely, forming short-lived empires of their own, ruled by local strongmen. Even Rome's belief system began to crack. The old gods no longer seemed to protect the empire. People turned to new religions, especially Christianity, which had begun spreading across the empire despite waves of violent persecution. It wasn't just one problem, it was all of them at once. This wasn't the Rome of Julius Caesar, Augustus, or Trajan. It was a broken empire, bleeding from 100 wounds, unsure of who would be in charge next week, let alone next year. The army, once the backbone of Roman power, was now a threat in itself. Soldiers no longer saw themselves as servants of the state, they saw themselves as kingmakers. If they didn't like their emperor, they killed him and picked another. The Senate was powerless. The rule of law meant little. What mattered was force, who had it, and how long they could hold on to it. And in this chaos, Rome needed someone, anyone who could restore order, someone with enough authority to be obeyed and enough experience to survive. That man was Valerian. In the year 253 AD, Valerian was chosen to lead the empire through its worst storm in centuries. He wasn't a young, ambitious general. He wasn't hungry for glory. He was already an old man by Roman standards, likely in his mid-50s or 60s, a former senator and a known quantity in the chaotic world of imperial politics. Valerian came from a noble senatorial family, part of the Roman elite for generations. He had held high office, including prestigious title of Princeps Senatus, the symbolic first man of the Senate. He was respected, seen as wise, cautious and honourable. Some sources even suggest he had once been offered the role of censor, one of the most powerful offices in the Roman system, but had declined. This wasn't a man who seized power through force, he was summoned to it. The soldiers who elevated him did so because he was trusted, not because he inspired fear, but because he offered a chance at stability. But while Valerian may have been the right man in the eyes of the Senate and the army, the world he inherited was already on fire. The Persians were pushing into Syria and Mesopotamia. Germanic tribes threatened Italy. The plague still raged, and across the empire the people were losing faith in the government, in the army, and in the very idea of Rome itself. And he had no idea that his own story would end in a way no Roman Empire before him had ever faced. When Valerian became emperor in 253 AD, he didn't take on the burden of Rome alone. From the very beginning he shared power with his son, Gallienus. It wasn't just a gesture of trust, it was a survival strategy. The empire was too big, too chaotic, and too unstable for one man to manage, so Valerian ruled the east, where the threat from Persia was growing stronger every day, while Gallienus stayed in the west to deal with the constant invasions and rebellions along the borders of Gaul and the Danube. Together, father and son hoped to hold the empire together. For a brief moment, it even seemed to work. Valerian led successful campaigns in the east. He recaptured Antioch, one of the largest cities in the Roman east, and restored much of the province of Syria to Roman control. These victories gave Rome a flicker of hope, the idea that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. But as we already mentioned, hope in the Roman Empire during the 3rd century was fragile, and for Valerian, disaster was waiting just over the horizon. The biggest threat Rome faced in the east wasn't a nomadic tribe or a minor uprising. It was an empire in its own right, the Sassanid Persians, led by King Shapur I. Shapur was no ordinary king. He was a ruler who believed his empire was destined to surpass Rome, and for good reason. Under his leadership, the Persian Empire had become one of the most powerful forces in the known world. Shapur had already humiliated Rome once before. In 244 AD, during the reign of Emperor Gordian III, Shapur had claimed victory in the Battle of Messèche. He had pushed deep into Roman territory, taken cities, and threatened Rome's eastern provinces like never before. Now he was preparing to do it again. Only this time, he wasn't just looking for loot, he wanted dominance. Valerian understood this, and in 259 AD, he moved his forces east, setting up his base in the city of Edessa, near the eastern frontier in what is today southeastern Turkey. It was a strategic location, close enough to confront the Persian advance, but still within the safety of Roman lines. But Edessa had a problem. It wasn't just on the edge of a war zone, it was in the middle of a plague. As Valerian gathered his legions, disease tore through the camp. Some historians believe it was smallpox, others think it was a deadly form of measles. Whatever it was lethal. Roman soldiers died by the thousands, their bodies piling up in makeshift graves. Discipline broke down, morale collapsed. The army that had once stood proud in Antioch was now weak, sick, and exhausted. And there was no time to regroup. Shapur was advancing. In 260 AD, Persian forces surrounded Edessa. Valerian was trapped. His army was outnumbered, his soldiers were starving, the disease was still spreading, and the Persians had the upper hand. Their cavalry was fast, mobile, and deadly, unlike anything the Romans had faced in the east in generations. Valerian had a choice: fight a battle he couldn't win, or try to negotiate. He chose to negotiate. It may have seemed like the logical move. He was a veteran politician, not just a general. He believed diplomacy could buy him time, perhaps even peace. According to some accounts, Valerian sent envoys to Shapur offering a ransom in exchange for safety and retreat. Shapur agreed to a meeting, but he made one condition: the emperor himself must come in person. Desperate and with few options left, Valerian accepted. What happened next was unthinkable. When Valerian arrived to meet the Persian king, he was seized. The emperor of Rome, once the most powerful man in the world, was taken alive by a foreign enemy. No Roman emperor had ever been captured before, not in centuries of war, not by Carthage, not by the Gauls, not even by Hannibal. To the Romans, it was beyond humiliation. It was a catastrophe. Some ancient sources say it was a trick, others say it was a surrender. There are even versions claiming that Valerian's own troops had turned against him, leaving him no choice but to seek protection from the Persians. Whatever the truth, one fact remains: Valerian never returned. For Shapur, it was a prize beyond measure. For Rome, it was the ultimate shame. The eastern armies were leaderless, the provinces were vulnerable, and Gallienus, still in the west, could do nothing to bring his father back. From this moment on, Valerian's story splits into legend and horror. When the Roman Emperor Valerian fell into the hands of Shapur, he wasn't treated like a typical prisoner of war. He wasn't locked in a cell. He wasn't sent to the mines or killed quickly to avoid embarrassment. Shapur had something else in mind. He turned the emperor into an object. According to some Roman and early Christian sources, most notably Gallienus, Valerian was kept alive not to be ransomed, but to be used as furniture. Whenever Shapur mounted his horse or ascended his throne, he would call for Valerian, and the former emperor of Rome, once the most powerful man in the Western world, would be forced to kneel on all fours before him, bent at the knees, his back arched, his hands flat against the ground. He had become a human footstool, not for a day, not for a week, but for years. Every time Shapur stepped onto Valerian's back, it was a message to his court, a message to foreign ambassadors, and most of all, a message to Rome. To the Persians, it was revenge. For generations they had watched Rome expand, conquer, and claim the mantle of supreme power. Persia had suffered Roman invasions, Roman interference, and Roman pride. But now the tables had turned. Now it was a Roman emperor who was being publicly degraded, reduced to a prop in the royal court. And not just any emperor. Valerian had been a seasoned senator, a commander, a man of dignity. He had ruled from the eastern throne of Rome, fought to protect his people, and led armies into battle. And now he was made to kneel like an animal while a foreign king used him as a stepping stool. To the Romans, this was unthinkable. The empire had built its image on glory, conquest, and control. Its emperors were seen as divine figures chosen by the gods or elevated by fate. They wore purple robes. They gave speeches to the Senate. Their faces were stamped on coins and carved into marble. To see one of them reduced to this, bent, broken, and used like a piece of furniture, was a horror the Roman imagination could barely accept. And yet the real weight of this humiliation didn't just rest on the symbolism. It rested on the man. What did it feel like to be Valerian? To wake up each morning not as a soldier, not as a leader, not even as a man, but as a tool in someone else's daily routine? What does it do to a person knowing that their name, once shouted in triumph by legions, is now a joke whispered in foreign courts? What breaks first in a man, his body or his soul? Can you imagine the leader of a superpower, the ruler of a vast empire, forced to kneel in front of his captors, not once, not in secret, but in public, day after day, year after year? Can you imagine the crowds laughing, the foreign envoys watching, the soldiers sneering? Can you imagine knowing that your own people, your generals, your senate, your son, would never come for you? That was the other wound. Valerian was not just humiliated by the Persians, he was abandoned by Rome. His son Gallienus ruled in the west. He knew what had happened, but he never marched east, never sent armies, never even made serious diplomatic efforts to negotiate his father's return. Some historians argue that Gallienus simply didn't have the resources. Rome was still at war on multiple fronts, and the empire was barely holding together. Others suggest that Gallienus feared what would happen if Valerian came back. 2 emperors, 1 throne. Either way, Valerian waited in vain. As the years passed, the daily ritual of being used as a living throne became routine. Shapur made sure that everyone in his court, every visiting ambassador, saw what he had done. He didn't have to shout, he didn't have to make threats. He had an emperor kneeling beneath him, and that said everything. There are no records of Valerian's words during captivity. We don't know what went through his mind. But the silence itself is telling. A man who once ruled over millions was now voiceless, nameless, reduced to a symbol of defeat. For some Persian sources, the story is different. Stone reliefs from sites like Nasher Rustam and Bishapur show Valerian standing, not kneeling, held by the wrist, not chained. In these depictions, he appears dressed in imperial robes, still visibly a king, if a defeated one. These carvings present a more civilized image of Persian victory, one that focuses on Persian strength without the spectacle of Roman humiliation. But Roman and Christian sources tell a different tale. They describe not just military defeat, but spiritual degradation, a kind of living death. And whether these accounts were exaggerated by Rome to evoke sympathy or invented by Christian authors like Gallienus to paint Valerian's fate as divine punishment for persecuting the church, one thing is clear. The idea of the emperor as a footstool burned itself into the historical imagination, because this was not how Roman emperors were supposed to fall. They could be stabbed in the Senate, poisoned by rivals, or betrayed by guards. They could die in battle, or even go down in a blaze of glory. But this slow, grinding humiliation, this ritual of public shame was different. It was something new, something worse. As time passed, the weight of years began to settle over Valerian like a slow, creeping shadow. The strength that had once allowed him to command armies now failed him when he tried to rise from sleep. His posture, once upright and imperial, had been gradually worn down by the routine of humiliation, and his skin, thinned by age and suffering, bore the silent testimony of a man who had lived too long beneath the boot of another. He was no longer the figure he had once been, not in body and perhaps not even in mind. The rituals that had once relied on his physical presence, kneeling, presenting his back, holding steady under the weight of a king, became increasingly difficult, if not impossible. His breath became shorter, his bones ached longer, his role in Shapur's theatre of conquest was coming to its natural end. And so, as his usefulness faded, the final chapter of Valerian's life began, not with dignity, not with rest, but with a final act of horror designed, it seems, to outlive him. Two versions of that final act have reached us through the accounts of ancient chroniclers, and historians have debated them for centuries. Neither version offers comfort, both are brutal in their own right, and neither allows for a peaceful end. One version, most famously told by Gallienus, speaks of a death tailored not only to punish the body, but to obliterate the man's very memory. According to this account, Shapur ordered that Valerian be flayed alive. His skin, carefully peeled from his flesh, was then dyed in rich vermilion, a deep red pigment often associated with royalty, and sewn back together like a garment. This gruesome shell, once the surface of an emperor, was stuffed with straw and mounted upright. The final result was not a corpse, but a display. Valerian's skin was placed in a Persian temple, visible to all those who entered. His body, or what remained of it, became a warning. It declared, without a single word, what happened to those who stood against Persia and lost. Yet this is not the only version. A different tradition, also drawn from Roman and Christian sources, claimed that Valerian was put to death by a far more symbolic and perhaps even crueler method. In this telling, he begged Shapur for mercy, perhaps offering ransom, perhaps simply pleading for release. In response, the Persian king melted down Roman gold and forced Valerian to drink it. This act, making a man swallow the very symbol of imperial greed and power until it burned him from within, was not just a form of execution, but a carefully crafted irony. The emperor who had once governed the riches of the empire was killed by the very thing he had once controlled. His death, in this version, was instantaneous but not painless, and like the story of the flaying, it was a spectacle meant to be remembered. Both versions reflect different facets of vengeance, one slow and public, the other fast and poetic. They differ in method, but not in tone. Both are acts not merely of violence, but of demonstration. Neither seeks justice in the traditional sense. Instead, they seek to leave a scar, not just on Valerian, but on Rome itself. What separates these two stories is not just how Valerian died, but how we remember him. The version involving flaying suggests that his body remained in Persia long after his soul departed, reduced to an artifact in someone else's shrine. The version with molten gold transforms his death into a legend of empire-consuming greed. One ends with a shell on display, the other ends with fire in his throat. Modern historians have approached both sides with caution. Some argue that Gallienus, as a Christian writer, had a clear motive, to show that persecutors of Christians were punished not just by man, but by divine will. Others note that the Persians themselves never recorded such details, and that their own depictions of Valerian, especially on rock reliefs at Nash Air Rostrum, show him standing in defeat, not mutilated. Still, there is no clear evidence that contradicts either version completely, and both continue to exist as part of this fragmented legacy of Valerian's fall. But when it comes to historical truth, it may not matter which version is exact, because whether his skin was displayed in a temple or his stomach was filled with gold, the fact remains that Valerian was broken, physically, politically, symbolically. His death marked not only the end of a man, but the collapse of everything he once stood for. He never returned to Rome lands. He never received a Roman burial. He vanished into the east, and what came back was only the memory of what had been done to him. You're probably wondering what happened to Rome after Valerian's death. The answer is simple. Everything fell apart. With the emperor gone, Roman power in the east collapsed almost overnight. The provinces that Valerian had fought to defend, Syria, Mesopotamia, parts of Asia Minor, were left exposed. Persian forces raided deeper than ever before, while local governors scrambled to protect what little remained. There was no central leadership, no organized counterattack, and no rescue mission. Rome had lost its eastern emperor, and with him it lost control. Back in the west, his son Gallienus tried to hold the empire together, but he was overwhelmed. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube. Civil wars broke out as usurpers declared themselves emperor. The empire fractured into three rival states: Rome, the Gallic Empire in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. It was no longer one empire, but a broken collection of desperate regions clinging to survival. But more than territory was lost, something deeper changed. Valerian's capture was a psychological blow. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor had been taken alive, publicly humiliated and used as a living symbol of defeat. That shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. If an emperor could be dragged away in chains, then who was truly safe? Power, once seen as divine, now looked vulnerable. Rome continued to exist for centuries. It would even recover territory, reform its armies, and reshape its politics. But something fundamental had changed. Rome never truly recovered from Valerian's fall. But what do you think? Did Valerian deserve his fate? Was this ancient justice or pure cruelty? Let us know what you think, and we'll see you in the next one.